Disclaimer: this program contains graphic descriptions of real crimes. Viewer discretion is advised. All parties are presumed innocent until proven guilty in court. Pastor's wife fell in love with a choir boy. 1 week later, he was found in the river. The townspeople would never forget the sight of Ruth Ward standing on the riverbank, clutching her hymn book as if it could shield her from the truth. Only a week earlier, she had been the picture of grace, a pastor's wife, devoted, untouchable. But now the whispers cut through the evening air like knives. She loved him. She risked everything for him, and now he's dead. The boy who sang hymns with the voice of an angel was pulled from the water, his lips blue, his future gone. Some called it a tragic accident. Others swore it was sin that had caught up with them. But the real story, what led a young choir boy into the arms of a pastor's wife and then into the river, was far darker than anyone dared to admit. They lit candles on the riverbank and sang the hymn he used to lead, their voices trembling in the night. When the river finally gave Micah back, face tilted toward the heavens, silt pressed into his mouth, the town thought they had their ending. But the river is never so simple. This story doesn't end with water swallowing the truth. It begins with a song. It was a Sunday morning like any other. The bell at St. Matthew's tolled through the small town, calling the faithful into its wooden wall. Families filed in with Bibles pressed against their chests. The pastor's wife, Ruth, stood near the front, her voice calm and controlled as she guided the choir through the opening hymn. But then he sang. Micah Hale, 20 years old, eyes like storm clouds about to break. He had a voice that didn't just carry through the church, it cut through the air, raw and haunting, the kind of sound that made even skeptics turn their heads. He wasn't just singing words, he was bleeding them into the rafters, and Ruth heard it. Every note pierced through the numbness she had worn like armor for years. For the first time in a long time, she felt alive. She should have looked away. Instead, her eyes found him, and in that fleeting moment, it felt like the hymn was theirs alone. By evening, the town had gone back to its ordinary rhythm. Sunday dinners, children playing in yards, gossip carried across fences. But Ruth could not silence the echo of his voice. That night, as she lay next to Pastor Elias, she listened not to her husband's steady breathing, but to the phantom sound of a choir boy by the river. And that's where the first crack appeared. The Monday after that fateful Sunday service, Ruth found herself staring at her phone longer than she should have. She had rehearsed the excuse. It was just choir business, nothing more. She typed quickly, keeping her words professional, but her heart pounded harder with every letter. Ruth, would you consider soloing Be Thou My Vision next month? She told herself it was innocent, pure, just church work. But when his reply came back almost instantly, she knew deep down this was no longer ordinary. Micah, I'd be honored, Mrs. Ward. Ruth is fine. A pause, then the one word that made her chest tighten. Micah, okay. Ruth, it was just her name, yet it sounded like a confession. That night, Ruth sat at the kitchen table, her tea going cold. Her husband, Pastor Elias, was in the next room, preparing his sermon with his usual diligence. His voice carried, calm, rehearsed, predictable, and all the while, Ruth's phone vibrated softly against the table. Micah again. I've been practicing by the river. It sounds better there. You should hear it sometime. She didn't respond, not at first. She tried to will herself to put the phone down, to forget the message, to be the loyal wife the entire town believed her to be. But when she finally fell asleep, her dreams weren't of sermons or scripture. They were filled with the sound of Micah's voice echoing over the rushing water, and when she woke, her lips whispered a name that wasn't her husband's. By Tuesday evening, she was there, at the river. She'd told herself she was simply meeting a choir member to rehearse. Nothing sinful, nothing improper, just music. The boardwalk stretched out into the water like a bridge between two lives. Micah was already waiting, hymnal in one hand, a battered thermos in the other. When he sang, the river seemed to harmonize with him. Ruth felt her chest ache with every note. It was dangerous, standing so close, their words so soft, their laughter too warm, and then it happened. A stray strand of her hair fell loose. Micah reached without thinking, brushing it back behind her ear with a touch that lingered a second too long. Her breath caught, his hand trembled. Micah, her voice was barely audible. It was supposed to be a warning. It sounded like a plea. "I know," he said, eyes wide with the fear of a boy caught in the fire of something much bigger than himself. They didn't kiss, not that night. But both of them walked away knowing the moment had already crossed a line, and the river, silent and eternal, had been their only witness. By Wednesday, the first whispers had already begun. It started in the choir loft, always the loft where gossip had wings. Leila, the choir director, noticed Ruth's gaze lingering a moment too long, noticed Micah's posture tilt unconsciously toward her. She told herself she'd seen it all before, innocent crushes, fleeting infatuations, but this felt different. She didn't speak it aloud. She didn't have to. The silence between rehearsals carried the suspicion for her. By noon, Deacon Daniel Pike was already hearing half, formed murmurs near the coffee urn. Tender hearts this season, Leila had told him cryptically. But Daniel was a man who prided himself on putting pieces together, and the pieces now pointed towards something dangerous, the pastor's wife and the choir boy. By evening, the town had a story, one it didn't need facts to support. Ruth was reckless, Micah was bold, and someone would have to pay. That night, Ruth stood at the kitchen counter, her hands trembling as she sliced peaches for a pie she didn't intend to eat. Elias, her husband, spoke about Sunday's sermon as though the world had not shifted beneath their feet. "The parable of the lost sheep," he said quietly, "how the shepherd leaves the 99 for the one." Ruth's knife struck the cutting board too hard. "And what if the one doesn't want to be found?" she asked, her voice colder than she meant it to be. Elias looked up at her, puzzled, but he said nothing. He never said anything. That was his flaw. He preached to the congregation with fire, but gave his wife only silence. Her phone buzzed against the counter. She didn't have to check to know who it was. Can't sleep either. Thursday morning began like any other. Pastor Elias unlocked his office, humming the faint outline of a hymn under his breath. He placed his worn Bible on the desk, ready to prepare another sermon about faith, about endurance, about God's unfailing love. But when he opened the door fully, a folded scrap of paper fluttered to the floor. No envelope, no signature, just jagged block letters that seemed carved into the page. "Check the river. Your house has leaks." Elias froze, the note trembling in his hand. It was vague, cryptic, but it dripped with accusation. He sat at his desk and pressed it beneath the weight of the family Bible, as if God himself could smother the words before they could breathe. He told himself it was probably nothing, just gossip, just mischief. But deep inside he knew. That night at dinner, Ruth's hands shook as she poured iced tea. Elias studied her in silence, hearing the echo of the note in his head. "You're quiet tonight," she said, forcing a smile. "Thinking about Sunday," he answered, "the parable of the lost sheep. And which are we, Elias?" Her eyes lifted to his, sharp, almost daring. "Shepherds or sheep?" His fork clattered against the plate. He didn't answer. He never did. While Elias tried to smother suspicion, the rest of the town let it spread like wildfire. Leila, the choir director, replayed Tuesday's river encounter in her mind. She had kept walking then, but her conscience gnawed at her. What if her silence allowed sin to take root? The youth leader, Serena, wasn't as restrained. She leaned into the choir rehearsal that evening, voice edged with righteousness. "If we don't set boundaries, the devil will," she snapped. "I've seen it before. Good people fall, and the whole church suffers." Some nodded, others shifted uncomfortably. The line had been drawn, sides were being chosen. By sundown the whispers had grown sharper, names now openly spoken. Ruth, Micah, and in small towns like theirs, whispers were as lethal as verdicts. That night Ruth sat alone in the darkened sanctuary, the silence pressing against her chest. Her phone buzzed again. "Meet me at the river tomorrow, just to talk. 900. Her breath caught, but when she looked closer, something about the message felt wrong. The number was unfamiliar, and Ruth, careful, terrified Ruth, hadn't sent it. Someone was pretending to be her. The message burned her palm even before she picked the phone up. She typed 3 words, "We can't do this," and then, before she could stop herself, she added a 4th. Yet her thumb hovered over the screen, shaking. She deleted it before sending, but in her heart the word still remained. Friday night draped itself over the town like a heavy curtain. The river shimmered beneath the moon, restless and black, as if it knew what was coming. Micah sat on his grandmother's porch, guitar resting across his knees, fingers plucking at strings that couldn't quite form a song. His phone buzzed again. The message glowed in the dark, same place as Tuesday. 900, come alone. He read it twice. His chest tightened. Ruth wanted to see him. Despite the risk, despite the whispers, despite everything, she still wanted him. He wanted to believe it, needed to believe it. Micah stood, slipped on his jacket, and told his grandmother he was heading out for milk. She smiled and nodded, unaware that it was the last time she'd see him alive. The boardwalk creaked beneath his weight as he walked toward the river's edge. The night air was sharp, carrying the scent of algae and engine oil. His heart raced, not with fear, but with longing. He could already see her, soft cardigan, perfume faint on the breeze, the same hesitant smile she'd worn by the river before. But when a figure stepped into the pool of light, it wasn't Ruth. It was Deacon Daniel Pike. His face was shadowed, but his voice was cold. "Sit down." Micah froze, confusion hardening into dread. "Daniel, what are you doing here? Sit." Daniel's tone wasn't a request. It was an order. Micah lowered himself onto the weathered bench, pulse pounding in his ears. Something was wrong. He reached for his phone, but Daniel's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising force. "Don't." Micah yanked back, his voice trembling. "You sent that message, didn't you, pretending to be her?" Daniel's eyes flickered, just for a moment, betraying the truth. "You don't understand what you're doing. You're playing with fire with her, with this church. You're a boy chasing what isn't yours. I'm not a boy." Micah said through clenched teeth, "And I care about her more than you care about anyone." For a moment, silence hung between them, sharp as broken glass. Then Micah added the words that sealed his fate. "I saw the numbers, Daniel, in the church ledger. The money's missing. You're the one tearing this place apart, not me." Daniel's jaw locked. His chest heaved with anger and fear. That single word, numbers, landed like a death sentence. The river murmured below them, dark and endless. Micah stood, defiant, ready to walk away. But Daniel's hand shot forward in a sudden shove. Hard, desperate, reckless. Micah staggered backward, heel catching on the boardwalk's edge. For one split second his wide eyes met Daniel's, then the river swallowed him whole. The splash echoed into the night. Daniel froze, staring at the rippling water, his chest hammering. He could have reached out. He could have saved him. Instead, he stepped back into the shadows, telling himself it was an accident, telling himself no one would ever know. But the river always knows. Sunday morning dawned with the bell at St. Matthew's tolling across a town already heavy with rumor. By the time the fishermen spotted the shape tangled in reeds, the air was thick with dread. Micah's body was pale, waterlogged, and still. His lips were blue, his eyes half closed as though he had one last hymn on the tip of his tongue. A fisherman screamed, and within minutes word rippled through the streets like wildfire. The choir boy has been found, dead in the river. The town poured down to the riverbank, their gasps and sobs filling the morning air. Mothers clutched their children, fathers bowed their heads, and in the middle of it all stood Ruth Ward. She staggered toward the water as if drawn by an invisible cord, her hymn book pressed tightly against her chest. When she saw him, her Micah lifeless and ruined, her knees buckled. Her husband Elias caught her by the arm, but the damage was done. The entire town saw her grief. It was too raw, too deep. It wasn't the grief of a pastor's wife for a choir member. It was something else, something forbidden, and the whispers, already vicious, turned into a storm. The coroner's report was swift and clinical: asphyxia by drowning, blunt trauma near the temple, water in the lungs. On paper it looked like an accident, but to the town it looked like sin finally collecting its debt. The choir gathered that evening in the sanctuary, their robes heavy with mourning. Leela led them through "It is well with my soul," but the words cracked halfway through. Jane, an alto, sobbed uncontrollably, her voice breaking the harmony. Nobody dared to hush her. Pastor Elias stood before the congregation, face carved in stone. He spoke of grief, of faith, of heaven's promise. But as he preached, his eyes kept straying to Ruth, her trembling hands, her tear-streaked face, the way she couldn't meet his gaze. Detective Alma Mensah, called in from the county, stood quietly at the back, notebook in hand. She watched, listened, and took in every glance, every whisper. She noticed Ruth's grief, too personal, too intimate, and she noticed Daniel Pike in the corner, wringing his hands, his boots muddy at the heel. Mensah didn't know the whole truth yet, but she knew one thing: this was no accident. Someone had pulled Micah to that river's edge. Someone had watched him fall. Detective Alma Mensah was not the kind of investigator who trusted appearances. She had seen too many small towns where polished sermons hid rotting truths, and from the moment she looked into Ruth Ward's trembling eyes and saw Daniel Pike's restless hands, she knew this was no simple drowning. The first clue came from Micah's phone records. His device was missing, never recovered from the river, but the carrier logs told a story. The last text he received came at 8:13 p.m. on Saturday night, same place as Tuesday, 900, come alone, the number wasn't Ruth. It traced back to a prepaid phone bought just an hour earlier at a gas station on the edge of town. Paid in cash, no cameras clear enough to give her a face, but Mensah knew what that meant. Someone wanted Micah at the river, and they wanted him to think Ruth had asked. When Mensah confronted Ruth with the message, the woman nearly collapsed. "I didn't send it," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "I swear on everything. I turned my phone off that night. I was trying to stop this before it went any further." Mensah believed her. Grief had a certain texture, and Ruth's was raw, uncalculated. But believing Ruth meant looking harder at who did want Micah silenced. Mensah pulled the deacons, choir members, and staff into quiet interviews. Most were evasive, hiding behind piety or platitudes, but one detail stuck out. Tony, the groundskeeper, mentioned seeing strange boot prints near the south access stairs of the Riverwalk early Sunday morning. Left heel was worn down funny, he said, looked like someone leaned in heavy on one side. Mensah wrote it down. She had already noticed Deacon Daniel's boots at the vigil. Good leather, but the left heel chewed thin. A small thing, but in investigations, small things open floodgates. She returned to her desk, studying the prepaid number again, her pen tapping against the log. Someone had lured Micah into the night with a lie. And someone had stood by as the river claimed him. The town thought it was sin. Mensah knew better. It was murder. Detective Alma Mensah believed in patience. Lies were like rotting beams in an old house. Push at the right spot, and the whole frame would groan. Her push came on Monday afternoon when she called Deacon Daniel Pike into his office. She set her recorder on the desk between them. The church ledger sat nearby, squared neatly as though it were a shield. "Where were you Saturday night?" she asked. Daniel's reply was smooth, too smooth, at home. "My brother Luke came over. We watched the game." "Anyone else see you?" "No," he said quickly, "just us." Mensa let the silence stretch until the air itself seemed to lean forward. People who were lying always felt the urge to fill silence. Daniel was no different. He fidgeted with his pen, then added, "Micah." He was troubled. Maybe he just gave up. But Mensa wasn't interested in theories. She was interested in facts, and the prepaid phone records, the worn heel prints, the missing church funds. They were all circling closer to Daniel Pike. She leaned forward. "Did you buy a prepaid phone Saturday?" His eyes flickered just for a second before settling back into the mask. "No." Mensa didn't challenge him directly. Instead, she reached for the boots resting by the wall. Good leather, left heel worn thin, exactly as the groundskeeper had described. She placed them gently on the desk. "Mind if I take these?" Daniel hesitated, just long enough to betray himself, before forcing a smile. Of course, detective, anything to help. But when he handed them over, his eyes darted, not to the boots, but to the ledger. And Mensa saw it. The fear of a man who knew the truth wasn't just in the water. It was written in numbers he thought no one would ever notice. Detective Mensa stayed late in the church office, the dim glow of a desk lamp illuminating the ledger Daniel Pike, guarded like scripture. Line by line, she traced the neat columns of numbers, donations, expenses, offerings. On the surface, everything balanced, but patience paid off. There it was, a $2,000 gap in the spring fundraiser account. The deposit slip was missing. Instead, a personal account in Daniel's brother's name showed a sudden mortgage payment, timed exactly with the fundraiser's supposed deposit. Daniel hadn't just stolen from the church. He had stolen salvation money meant for youth programs, for missions, for the very choir Micah sang in. Mensa could almost hear Micah's voice echoing over the pages. "I saw the numbers, Daniel. The money's missing." And suddenly it all clicked. Micah hadn't just been a risk because of Ruth. He had been a threat to Daniel's carefully concealed theft, a threat that had to be silenced. The next morning, Mensa called Daniel back in. She set the ledger open in front of him, her finger tapping the empty line where the deposit should have been. "Funny thing about numbers," she said evenly, "they don't lie, not unless someone makes them." Daniel's jaw tightened. He tried to mask it with a shrug. "Bookkeeping errors happen. Micah thought so too." Mensa said softly, "That's why you met him at the river. That's why he's dead." Daniel's face blanched. For a moment, the weight of silence hung in the room. Then he broke, slamming his fist onto the desk. "I didn't mean for it to happen." He wouldn't shut up. He said he'd tell the pastor. "I only meant to scare him." He slipped. His voice cracked, echoing off the office wall. He realized too late what he had confessed. Mensa closed the ledger gently, as though sealing a coffin. "No, Deacon," she said, "he didn't slip. You pushed him into the river and into his grave." Daniel's shoulders slumped. The mask had finally shattered. Detective Mensa didn't need fireworks to end her case. Just paperwork, patience, and timing. By Wednesday morning, she had it all: the ledger gap, the bank trail, the prepaid phone receipt, and Daniel Pike's half, broken confession. She walked into Sunday service with 2 uniformed deputies at her side. The sanctuary fell silent as the detectives stepped into the aisle, boots clicking against the wooden floor. People whispered police and arrest as though the words themselves might shatter the stained glass. Daniel sat near the front, pale and rigid, clutching his hymnal like it could still save him. When Mensa's hand touched his shoulder, he flinched. Daniel Pike, she said, voice steady, "You're under arrest for fraud, obstruction, and the death of Micah Hale." Gasps rippled through the congregation. Ruth pressed her hymn book to her chest, her eyes wide with grief and vindication all at once. Pastor Elias stood frozen, as though the pulpit itself had betrayed him. Daniel didn't fight, he didn't cry, he only lowered his head as the handcuffs clicked into place, muttering, "I only meant to scare him. I didn't mean for him to die, but the river didn't care about intentions." The scandal ripped through the town like a storm. Some people shook their heads in sorrow, muttering about temptation and sin. Others raged that a deacon, a man trusted with the church, his very lifeblood, had stolen from God and spilled blood to keep it hidden. The choir, once a family bound by harmony, now felt hollow. Micah's absence was a wound that every hymn reopened. When they sang, it was as if the notes were stained, and Ruth, her grief was written plainly on her face. She had lost more than anyone dared to say aloud. Not only the boy who had awakened her silent heart, but also the trust of her husband, the respect of her congregation, and the life she once thought she understood. At home, Elias confronted her in quiet devastation. "You loved him," he whispered, not a question, but a statement. Ruth didn't deny it. Tears streaked her face. "I never touched him, but yes, I loved him more than I meant to, more than I should have." Elias turned away, the man of God undone by something no sermon could fix. Within weeks, he resigned his position, unable to stand at the pulpit without seeing betrayal in the pews. Their marriage, fractured by silence long before Micah, finally crumbled. The trial ended quickly. Daniel Pike pled guilty to fraud and manslaughter, his voice trembling as the judge read the charges. He would spend years behind bars, years that would never balance the ledger of a stolen life. The town tried to heal, but every hymn still carried Micah's voice in the silence between the notes, and Ruth Ward, once the graceful pastor's wife, became a shadow of herself. The church that had once praised her now avoided her gaze. Her marriage to Elias dissolved quietly, without shouting, without spectacle. Just two people walking away from vows that had long since withered, but the river still called to her. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Ruth returned to the boardwalk where it had all begun. She carried a bouquet of cheap white flowers, their stems wrapped in trembling fingers. The water lapped at the posts below, restless, hungry, whispering secrets only she could hear. She sat on the same bench where Micah had waited that night. For a long time she didn't move. She simply listened. The creak of wood, the hum of cicadas, the faint rush of water against stone. It was almost enough to imagine he was still there, guitar slung over his shoulder, eyes bright with possibility. Ruth opened her hymnal. Her voice cracked at first, but she forced the words out, barely louder than a whisper. "Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart." Her tears blurred the page, her throat ached. But she sang every verse, her voice carried away on the wind. For a moment she could almost believe Micah was singing beside her, the river harmonizing like it had that Tuesday night. When she finished, she placed the flowers on the bench. She didn't throw them into the water. The river had already taken too much. Instead, she left them where someone might find them, a quiet offering of memory and regret. As she turned to leave, the church bell rang in the distance. The sound rolled across the town, across the water, across her fractured heart. The town would always remember the story a certain way. The pastor's wife fell in love with a choir boy. 1 week later, he was found in the river. It was neat, it was simple, it was wrong, because the truth was messier. The truth lived in broken silences, in ledgers inked with lies, in hands that didn't reach when they could have, and in the heart of a woman who had loved too deeply, too dangerously, and lost everything. Ruth paused one last time at the edge of the boardwalk, the river's voice in her ears, and then she whispered into the dark, "Forgive me." The river didn't answer, it never did. But if you listened closely, You could almost hear a baritone voice rising with the current, carrying a hymn into eternity,